For decades, dual booting has been the quiet ritual of power users, developers, students, and curious tinkerers who wanted the best of both worlds. You installed Windows because you had 4 games for certain professional software, for familiarity, and for compatibility with the wider world. Then you installed Linux because you wanted freedom, control, performance, transparency, and an operating system that felt like it truly belonged to you. You learned how to partition disks, shrink volumes, fight with bootloaders, fix grub after Windows updates broke it, and choose which OS to launch every time you powered on your machine. Dual booting was never convenient, but it was a compromise that made sense in a world where Windows and Linux lived in entirely separate universes. But now, something strange is happening. Something that would have sounded impossible just a few years ago. The walls between Windows and Linux are quietly dissolving, feature by feature, update by update, until the question is no longer how to dual boot, but whether dual booting even makes sense anymore. To understand why this feels so radical, you have to remember how deep the divide used to be. Windows was a closed ecosystem, tightly controlled by Microsoft, built around proprietary APIs, proprietary file systems, proprietary drivers, and a philosophy that assumed the user should not see or touch the internals. Linux was the opposite. Open source, community-driven, modular, transparent, and built on Unix principles that emphasized small tools, composability, and user control. For years, these two worlds barely acknowledged each other except through compatibility layers, virtual machines, or awkward third-party tools. If you wanted Linux, you rebooted into Linux. If you wanted Windows, you rebooted into Windows. That was the deal. Then Microsoft did something that shocked almost everyone. It embraced Linux, not just rhetorically, but architecturally. At first, it seemed like a developer convenience, a way to attract programmers who are increasingly abandoning Windows for macOS and Linux, the Windows subset. For Linux appeared as a curiosity, a lightweight compatibility layer that lets you run Linux command line tools directly on Windows. Early versions were limited, imperfect, and clearly secondary. But Microsoft kept investing in it. WSL evolved from a translation layer into something far more ambitious, running real Linux kernels, supporting system calls, networking, and eventually full graphical Linux applications. Suddenly, you could run a Linux terminal, Linux tools, and Linux apps inside Windows without rebooting, without virtualization in the traditional sense, and without dual. At the same time, Linux itself began to absorb ideas traditionally associated with Windows. Desktop environments became more polished, more user-friendly, and more visually consistent. Gaming on Linux exploded thanks to technologies like Proton, Vulkan, and improved driver support. Professional software that once existed only on Windows began to appear on Linux, either natively or through compatibility layers that worked so well they felt native. The practical reasons for needing Windows started to shrink, while the philosophical reasons for wanting Linux remained strong. What we are witnessing now is not a simple case of one operating system copying another. It is a convergence driven by shared technologies, shared developer ecosystems, and shared user expectations. Containers, virtualization, cloud-native workflows, and cross-platform frameworks have made the underlying operating system less visible and less important for many tasks. Developers write code that runs in containers, not directly on the host OS. Applications are built with web technologies or cross-platform toolkits that behave the same on Windows, Linux, and Mac OS. In this world, the OS becomes a substrate, a host for workloads, rather than the center of the experience. Windows, recognizing this shift, has been steadily transforming itself into something that looks suspiciously like a Linux system under the hood. The integration of OpenSSH, OpenSSL, native package managers, and Unix-like tooling is not accidental. The push toward PowerShell core, which runs on Linux, Mac OS, and Windows alike, is another signal. The adoption of container technologies that were born in the Linux ecosystem shows how deeply Microsoft has committed to this direction. Even the file system and process models in Windows have been evolving to better align with Unix-like behavior, reducing friction between the two worlds. From the Linux side, the story is equally interesting. Linux distributions are increasingly aware that many users come from Windows, and they design their desktops, installers, and workflows accordingly. Seamless dual boot installers, automatic driver detection, and polished app stores are no longer niche features. Linux desktops can now mount NTFS partitions reliably, access Windows file systems, and even interoperate with Windows networks and services in ways that once required significant effort. In enterprise environments, Linux and Windows servers already coexist so closely that the distinction often feels academic. As these changes accumulate, the classic dual boot setup starts to feel like an artifact of the past. Why reboot into Linux to use a terminal when your Windows system already runs a full Linux environment? Why maintain two separate installations, two sets of updates, two sets of configurations, when a single system can host both experiences simultaneously? For many users, the answer is increasingly unclear. Consider the daily workflow of a modern developer. You might write code in a cross-platform editor, run it in a Linux container, test it in a browser, and deploy it to a cloud server running Linux. Whether your laptop boots Windows or Linux becomes almost irrelevant. What matters is that the tools work, the environment is consistent, and the friction is minimal. Windows, by embedding Linux deeply into its architecture, removes one of the last reasons developers had to abandon it entirely. Linux, by embracing compatibility and user-friendliness, removes many of the barriers that kept Windows users away. This convergence also reflects a deeper philosophical shift. For years, the narrative was that Windows and Linux were competitors in a zero-sum game. If one gained users, the other must lose them. But in reality, the tech landscape has become more complex. Microsoft no longer makes most of its money selling Windows licenses. Its revenue comes from cloud services, enterprise solutions, and developer platforms that run on Linux as much as on Windows. From that perspective, it makes perfect sense to blur the line between the two, to create an ecosystem where Windows users are comfortable with Linux tools and Linux users are comfortable with Microsoft services. The result is a hybrid reality that challenges our old mental models. When you open a terminal on Windows and see a Linux prompt, are you using Windows or Linux? When you run a Linux GUI app inside a Windows window manager, which OS is in control? When your file system seamlessly crosses the boundary between NTFS and ext4, does that boundary even matter anymore? These questions may sound philosophical, but they have practical implications for how we think about computing. Dual booting was always about choice, about the freedom to select the best tool for the job at boot time. But what happens when that choice moves from the bootloader to the desktop, from rebooting into another OS to opening another window? The end of dual booting does not mean the end of Linux or the end of Windows. It means that the distinction between them is becoming less rigid, more fluid, and more contextual. Of course, this does not mean dual booting is dead for everyone. There will always be users who need a pure, uncompromised Linux environment, whether for performance, security, ideological reasons, or simply personal preference. There will always be gamers who want the absolute best compatibility and performance from Windows without any abstraction layers. There will always be tinkerers who enjoy the ritual of configuring a bootloader and maintaining separate systems. But for the majority of users, especially newcomers, the cost-benefit calculation is changing. The idea of rebooting your entire machine just to access a different set of tools feels increasingly archaic in an era of instant context switching. We already expect to run multiple operating systems on our phones, tablets, and servers through virtualization and containers without thinking about it. The desktop is simply catching up to this reality. Windows and Linux are no longer islands. They are overlapping circles in a shared ecosystem. This merging also raises important questions about identity and control. If Linux runs inside Windows, who ultimately controls the environment? If Microsoft provides the Linux kernel updates, the integration layers, and the surrounding infrastructure, does that change what Linux means? Conversely, if Windows increasingly relies on Linux components and open source technologies, does that make Windows less proprietary in spirit, even if it remains proprietary in license? These are not questions with simple answers, but they highlight why this convergence is so significant. For longtime Linux users, there is a mix of excitement and unease. On one hand, seeing Linux tools and workflows become mainstream is a vindication of decades of open source development. On the other hand, there is a fear that Linux could become reduced to a subsystem inside a larger proprietary platform. For Windows users, the story is often one of relief. They can access powerful tools without abandoning the familiar environment they rely on. What is clear is that the old narrative of choosing sides is breaking down. You no longer have to declare yourself a Windows user or a Linux user in the same way you once did. You can be both simultaneously on the same machine in the same session without compromise. That reality makes the concept of dual booting feel less like a power user trick and more like a historical footnote. The end of dual booting, if it comes, will not be marked by an announcement or a dramatic shift. It will happen quietly, as more users realize they no longer need it, as tutorials fade away, and as new generations of users grow up never knowing a time when Windows and Linux were strictly separate worlds. They will take for granted that tools, apps, and environments can coexist, that the operating system is flexible, and that rebooting is something you do for updates, not for identity. In the end, the merging of Windows and Linux is not about one winning over the other. It is about the evolution of computing toward a more layered, modular, and interoperable future. Dual booting was a solution to a problem that made sense in a divided world. As that world merges, the solution becomes less necessary. And when you step back and look at it, that might be one of the most profound shifts in personal computing we have seen in decades.